to meet you all. My name is Maeve Campbell. I am a climate journalist here in London. I work mainly with Channel 4 News and I write for Forbes and various other outlets. And I'm really pleased to be here today to host this next session with the amazing Drew Purves. So, who is Drew? Drew is the head of nature at Google's AI lab, DeepMind. Prior to Google, Drew spent 18 years in ecological research and environmental data science at the University of Cambridge, the University of York, Princeton, and at Microsoft, collaborating with scientists, universities, and NGOs on biodiversity and nature research. Nowadays, he spends a lot of his life explaining and demystifying the current AI revolution, how that relates to nature and how we can harness it for good. So our conversation today is all about mapping the biosphere, aka how AI software can now accurately map out species and habitats all over the world in a way that's never ever been done before. So we're going to discuss why this is hugely significant to improving our efforts in both the conservation and the restoration spheres, because those are different things, as we know, and how it could even help policymakers make more informed decisions for the fate of our planet. So, Drew, where should we start?
Actually, there's one thing I feel like I should say, which is,
yes.
I mean, this is a bit nerve-wracking, being surrounded by amazing people that are doing conservation work like this on the ground in such innovative ways. And the people here are just the tip of an iceberg, a global iceberg of others out there doing their best to protect nature every day. And that's a very humbling, slightly nerve-wracking a situation for me. But on the other hand, in common with most ecology and biodiversity audiences, everyone seems really nice. So I'm telling myself that, but a big thanks for the invite. It's scary, but it's great to be here.
Well, thank you to you too. And I agree, it's so nice to be all together. Thank you to Whitley for that. So I'm going to start just by doing, I'm a journalist, so my job is to break things down. Drew's the genius, and I'm the one who's going to translate it all for everyone else. So I go on Google Maps when I want to find the best route to drive somewhere, to find a new restaurant. It shows me all the things and the places that I need to know in my surroundings. So to explain your map, is it fair to say that the Biosphere map is like Google Maps, but for nature?
Basically is fair to say that. It's a very good analogy. I mean, in three ways. I mean, one, it's a map. That's kind of the obvious one. I think the other two are the more interesting analogies. The second one is that, like you said, Google Maps is useful. It's actually useful for directing our actions, and we use it to make decisions, whether that's short-term decisions, turn left or right, or whether that's long-term decisions, like maybe where you're going to move to in 5 or 10 years' time. So we want the nature maps to be useful for the people that are actually protecting and restoring nature, whether that's governments operating at national or international scales, or even local communities, indigenous groups like we heard, et cetera, protecting nature at the local scale. The second analogy is that it's a shared resource. Google Maps is a shared resource. So Google has done its part, assembling the world's information, making it universally acceptable and useful. That's Google's mission. But actually, a lot of the information in Google Maps has been contributed by the users as well. And it would have been impossible to build Google Maps without that input from countless millions of people around the world. And I think, again, we want that for this nature map. We can do our bit to aggregate the information, but we also need everybody else to be doing their part to enter the data and et cetera, to refine it.
So we've got all of these Google products we can think of. We've got Google Maps. We've also got Google Earth. So how is this different to, say, Google Earth? What can it show us? If I'm looking at restaurants on Google Maps, which I am a lot of the time, what are we looking at on your nature map?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Google Earth. That's one of the reasons that doing this kind of work for me is thrilling within Google, because it actually had this very long-standing commitment to nature, biodiversity, and sustainability. There's a thing called Google Earth Engine, which was originally designed to serve up enormous amounts of satellite information, and is now a way that many organizations share additional sort of geospatial information, think different kinds of maps of different things. And then there's Google Earth, which is a sort of usable front end that many organizations use. And actually, one of its main use cases around the world is actually to do with nature and biodiversity. So one of the things I'd really want to stress is that, over the centuries and decades and over recent years, all sorts of different organizations, individuals and companies have contributed to the understanding of the world that we have today. You know, that great history of exploration and travel and observing species around the world, the museums, and then more recently, in the era of the internet, big players like Google have helped assemble that data together into the maps that we have. So we're starting from a lot more than zero when we're looking to map things. But as we heard in the intro earlier, actually, when it comes down to it, often, especially at finer spatial scales, we don't yet have the fine-grained information that we need to guide a lot of action.
And what are we looking for? Because I know you've been focusing on mapping forests, and what you've actually said is that, I mean, is this true? We actually don't know where the forests are. Is that right?
That's right. And again, slightly in that yes and no kind of way that I just hinted at, which is, of course, we don't mean to imply that we don't, on aggregate, overall, have a pretty good idea of broad sweep. We heard earlier about, of course, we know that the Amazon is the world's largest intact tropical forest, etc. We also know that we've lost a lot of tropical forest, and we know that in the temperate zone, we're seeing a lot of forest regrowth as we get farm abandonment, etc. So we have a good understanding of some of the broad sweeps. But again, when we go down to finer grain, let's say, for instance, you're like here in the UK and you're involved in a planning application for development, and you really need to say, are we going to think about on the left of the village or on the right of the village, etc. Down at that fine grain, then often we don't have the information that we need. Another example is the recent EUDR regulation. So this is new EU-wide regulation that mandates that all companies importing certain goods into the UK can demonstrate that the supply chains are free of deforestation. And to do that, you actually need to be able to track natural forests, for example, at fine spatial scales through time, right down at the level of where the for instance, palm oil is being sourced from. And so that level of information, we're not quite there yet. I mean, again, I want to stress there are previous maps that people have done and with remote sensing, but we think that we have a really good opportunity to significantly improve those using AI at the moment.
It's crazy because you'd think that when you're looking down from a satellite, you'd be able to see, where the forests are. But actually, what you're saying is the technology isn't advanced enough yet to know also the types of forests, things like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's a really good example. I mean, one of the things, and we all know that we have this nature crisis, and I just can't stop myself being optimistic because I see so many great things. And one of the amazing things is that we as humans have put these satellites up in the sky. They're these mobile cameras. They're looking down at the Earth. That's an incredible thing, right? But if you look at those by the human eye, so you're limited. You can only really look at RGB. You should try it. If you look, you'll find huge swathes of forest. They all just kind of looks green to us, right? It's very difficult. But actually, those satellites are gathering multi-band information. It's not just RGB, and they're gathering that information every few days often. And we have multiple satellites measuring different things. So together, that's an enormous amount of raw data that's available. But by the human eye, we can't pull out what we need. But that's one of the areas where this recent AI revolution really excels. That is extracting the salient signals from huge, complex input data sets. And the satellite data is very much in that category.
And I know that AI, so in this data monitoring, you use something called large language models. Explain what that is. Imagine that we're all, like a primary school class right now. Not to patronize you, but just because it's really hard to understand what this actually is.
I think in the world of AI, we're all in a primary school class, even me. So we're at the beginning now. We don't know. Nobody can keep up with everything. So if you ever feel like that, just believe. Honestly, I feel like that too. So yeah, so it may be worth a little kind of minute or two of kind of AI 101 there, in the sense that you can think of AI in many ways, in terms of inputs and outputs. And what's happened over the decades is that we have a huge amount of data, the inputs for these models. We're carrying out experiments now with, say, 100 million times more data than we were 20 years ago. Like we saw in Martin Wikelski's talk earlier, animal tracking data, but also, ecology, species data, citizen science data. We've got this exponential increase in data. And so we have these data inputs, and what AI specializes in is really taking those inputs and creating outputs that we care about. Now, traditionally, that's quite focused, so you would focus on a particular area. And one that would be familiar to many people here would be unimaginable 20 years ago. On my phone, I can point my phone at a plant now and ID the plant, and it's just thrilling. Even insects, it was incredible. Or you'll be aware of, the apps where you can listen to birdsong and ID a birdsong. So these are all powered by this modern AI revolution, which is the data, and they have these special models, which is called deep learning. And then it needs a lot of compute. So it's those three things together: the data, these special models, and compute. Now, when we're doing the remote sensing work, we're very much the same in a way as pointing your camera at a plant, taking a picture of the plant, but instead these cameras are floating in the sky and we're taking the satellite picture and pulling out what we want to know. Is it natural forest? Is it plantation forest? Is it a wetland or what have you? So that's kind of the basics. And then the large language models, they're a little bit different. So they're models that originally started out doing that, but for the space of language, human language. So large tracts of text. And originally you could take a little bit of text in, and all they do is actually predict the text that is coming next. So this is the kind of 101 part. That's all they do. Doesn't sound very exciting, right? But until you realize, well, wait, actually, if you put in, what's the capital of France? And if Paris comes out the other end, you think, oh, I've got something that's maybe useful, maybe a bit basic. So what's happened is, as these models have got large, as they become large language models, we've been able to deal with huge amounts of text input and get really useful text output. So for example, I could say, here are all of the documents relating to this national park. Can you now help me to draft a conservation plan for that national park that would conform to all local regulations and would be potentially appealing to a foreign donor? That's actually the same fundamentally as the capital of France and Paris from the point of view of the AI. So
It's almost like, yeah, for you, I mean, for us, it's kind of like what we would maybe use ChatGPT for,
right.
but you're using it on a much, much larger level. And so let's talk about some more concrete examples, because what you were saying there brings in the role of local organizations, communities, citizen science in the data collection. Weezer earlier is from the Loisa ecosystem in Sumatra. Would someone like Weezer be an example of someone who's living in an ecosystem? What kind of data would she be inputting to help your map?
That's right. One of the so it's absolutely right that the AI can only contribute to nature insofar as it connects with and actively empowers local decision makers and local actors like local communities. And this actually relates to an interesting trend that's happening in AI. I'm still slightly in teacher mode. I'll come back out in a second, which is up until recently, we often assumed that in any new use of AI, you would have to sort of start again. You'd have your own data and your own model, and you would have to train that model to get the outputs that you wanted. So it's kind of specific, like isolated form of AI development. And that often meant you needed a lot of your own data, a lot of your own compute, and a lot of specialist skills to do that. What's happened now in the world of these LLMs and in other areas now, we're in an era of foundational modeling where a small number of organizations with enough resources can take huge amounts of data and train a general purpose model. And then what happens is local actors can then fine tune and adapt that model in different ways for their local purposes. And what that means is they need a lot less data than ever before, a lot less compute, and they don't need the same level of skills.
So it's more efficient.
Yeah.
So and what kind of data would that be? Give us some examples.
Yeah, I'll give you one example. So we have a project called Perch, which we're very proud of. So that's a foundational model for bioacoustics. So people might be familiar with bioacoustic monitoring. It came up around the oceans earlier. But because it's a foundational model, it means that practitioners on the ground can develop a detector for something new for the first time. So you're not limited by what comes with the model. So that could be a rare species that hasn't yet been for which no detector is available. You might want to distinguish juveniles from adults, or a special call, like a certain voice call, like an alarm call, etc. And if you can just come up with a few examples of that yourself, then on top of this foundational model, you can then train that new detector. And we've done recent experiments showing that actual practitioners, conservation scientists in the field, can actually develop a new detector like that in a total of 1 hour of human effort. So so 1 hour later, between your first and your by the time you've done your second coffee, you've got that new detector on the device, on those audio moths, out they go, and you can develop new.
And what is your big aim? What do you really hope to achieve with this biosphere map?
Yeah, so actually, we didn't talk too much about the mapping. So maybe just explain that one of the things we're really interested in then is at global scales, but also in a way that can be adapted locally, is mapping habitats, but also mapping species. All the plants, all the fungi, all the insects, etc. In the end, we should be ambitious, right? That's where we'd like to get to. But also, as anyone in this room can tell you, that's not enough. You need to map threats as well. So things like deforestation pressure, land use change. So one of our recent mapping products, we look backwards over the last 20 years, and we we identified deforestation, but then we actually attributed the underlying drivers of that. It was actually forest loss, the underlying drivers of forest loss. And we were able to map that at very fine scales down to 30-meter resolution. For example, the patterns of shifting agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, but also the big uptake in loss from fire in northern latitudes, for instance, in Canada. Although I'm optimistic enough to think that, yes, we want to map threats, but we also ought to be mapping opportunities too. You know?
Absolutely. And I know that it can also help with real-time alerts, you say, the onset of things like floods and fires. How does that work?
Yeah, that's right. So, in some of the mapping work, we would take a year's worth of data, let's say, and try to come up with an aggregate map of, say, habitat. But because those satellites are going over frequently, you can actually detect individual events. So I have Google colleagues, for example, that have developed real-time flood alerts, real-time fire alerts, things like this.
And that can have real concrete, impacts in the community.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, of course, it goes back. People, quite rightly, has been a big focus of our discussion here today. So, of course, that can have a major impact on people, giving people early warning signals for floods and fires. But some of those events can be very relevant for ecology and conservation as well. Yeah.
And something I mentioned in the intro, which I thought was particularly interesting, is that the map might even have the potential to pick up changes to government policy or even incorporate news stories as and when they happen to kind of better inform and better predict the future of certain geographies. Is that right? That sounds mad and great.
And actually, it relates back to that bit of 101 we did around large language models. So the idea is when we're doing a certain style of work where we're taking the satellite data and mapping the habitats, that goes under vision AI. So this is basically imagery. But of course, a lot of the information that you would want to understand related to a place doesn't come in the form of images or even sounds, but actually comes in language form. And that could be things like local government regulation, national regulation, or news stories, etc. There's a huge amount of relevant information in that language form. And prior to the large language models, it was quite difficult to sort of integrate that data in any formal way. So, but now we have these models, they can actually help us to do that. Another interesting thing you might want to know is that the systems now, these LLM core models, and they're nested within a wider system that allows the models to do things like search the web and so on. This is called retrieval augmentation, but don't worry about that. But
we won't get to
that's right.
explain that.
So it means you can use these models to actually go and search the web for all of the relevant information for your particular decision. They can then aggregate that back together and give you back that in the form you want. And let's not forget, in the language you want. So even if a lot of that relevant information is coming in, for example, in English, if it's not your native language, you can have that presented back to you in a way that is useful to you. And there was a really interesting example earlier. We were hearing about the legal case against the mining in Indonesia. Yeah. And that's a really good example, right? And at the moment, as we all know, that's a very human-limited process. Engaging with law and with legal systems is very, very difficult. But with LLMs, we can really empower people to understand that. It was a really interesting lesson there, which is fundamentally the law was there, it just wasn't being applied, and people didn't feel empowered enough to stand up and enforce the law. But I mean, thankfully, in that case, they got assistance and they were able to do that. But what if we could democratize that so that a much wider group of people, including disempowered indigenous communities, for example, could understand and get the law back on their side?
So it has so many uses. It's a big bank. It's how I see it. It's a kind of map. It's AI driven. It's got sounds. It's got visuals. It's got words. And it sounds like it could be pretty life-changing. Will AI ever get to a place where it replaces conservationists?
I mean, I would say no, but also I hope not, because that's just absolutely not the intention. And it's conservation is such an area where we're so people limited. Luckily, we have a number of people all around the world with the passion and the energy to work on it. I don't think those people are going to go away, and we don't want them to go away. What we want to do is empower them, of course. That is the ultimate purpose of all of these AI systems. They wouldn't work anyway without the input from people, without the human. All the AI that we use today actually depends on so much human annotation and supervision of all kinds of different forms. So even just to do a good job of this, we need those conservationists. But also the purpose is to empower those conservationists. Absolutely.
So luckily we're all okay.
Absolutely.
And before we just go to some questions from the audience, we spent this conversation very zoomed out, and I just thought it might be nice to end kind of looking at a more local context. And asking you, tell us, what do you do in your own garden and how does that data feed into the map you're creating, which is global?
I mean, all of this sort of stuff just blows my mind. And again, Google is very much just one part of this wider ecosystem of, NGOs and government agencies and small and large tech companies and so on. And this all comes together for me in my garden sometimes. So I'm lucky enough to have a big garden. I live up in rural Norfolk. And when we moved in, there were lots of mature trees. That was fantastic all around the edge. But the middle was like a golf green, really. And so we had this idea, let's stop mowing, plant a few trees, dig a pond, let the brambles and nettles come up into the flower beds. All the kind of, for someone who's British like me, I mean, it's quite shocking stuff, right? But it's been such a joy. And I work outside a lot. And now what happens is I sit out there with my laptop and just weird insects turn up all the time. But what's great is when they do, I take a picture of them. And then I go onto a thing called iNaturalist, and iNaturalist lets me ID the insects, and then I know what the insect is. Then I go to Wikipedia and
then they're
read
in the
about
map.
the insect. That's right, and then they get uploaded, and then the iNaturalist data feeds into national databases and international databases. So, for example, in our species mapping work, which is a little bit earlier stage, we're at the stage now where we're mapping a few hundred species at continental scales, which is exciting. We base that on a public database called GBIF. It's the single largest database of species observations. Well, that data from my garden makes it through to GBIF automatically. And this is already, of course, AI powered. That ID of that insect is AI powered. So AI is already revolutionizing the science of ecology and moving into conservation in that way, in bringing in more data. What we're really trying to do then is to say, can we aggregate more and more of that data together into maps and then predictions that will help people act in places where we don't yet have any data. So it all comes out. The most recent one was a thing called a spider wasp. I didn't know there was a thing called a spider wasp. These are spiders that predate on wasps. And I know this because one turned up on my laptop, and there was a paralyzed spider on its back, and the wasp was dragging it around. And I was like, what am I seeing? And so these stories are one of the things I love about this is that, and you mentioned about how AI is not there to replace anyone. It absolutely isn't, especially not conservationists. But also we think of AI perhaps being, technological and industrial and functional. And yet for me, when things like that happen, this is a joy. This is helping me to connect to nature. It's throwing incredible stories in my face, and it's a joy. And I think that should be another, hopefully a thing that AI can accelerate is that deep connection with nature.
That's a really nice note, actually, because, when I think of you and I think of you kind of, building your software and your coding and your maps, and it's very inside. But then, of course, you can do that in your garden and you're contributing in your own local surroundings. So I agree. It is a very hopeful concept. So I'm just going to go to some questions that are coming in from Slido. So we have a question from Philippa. So as you work at Google, the question is, are you concerned about data storage, energy consumption, and powering AI as it grows and grows?
Thanks for the question. It's a really good question. And yes, we are concerned about that. I mean, AI is growing extremely rapidly. And as I mentioned, at its core, it depends on large amounts of data, which has to be stored somehow. And then it depends on these large models, and training a large model on large amounts of data takes a large amount of compute. And to give you a headline statistic, I think the largest machine learning experiments today are using something like 1 trillion times more compute than the largest experiments 10 or 20 years ago on 100 times more data. So on the other hand, please don't equate that to 1 trillion times more energy use, because the compute has got extremely more energy efficient. But nonetheless, the balance between the two is an increase in energy use applied to AI and data centers. So it's definitely a concern. I do have an analogy, though, that I'll bring up, and it's not meant to be flippant at all. It's supposed to be a genuine, thought-provoking analogy. And then maybe I'll say a little bit about Google's position on energy as well. So the analogy is this, that most of us in this room have probably had an experience where we've flown somewhere, and then at the other end, we've got in a vehicle. And many of the people here, that vehicle might have been something like a Toyota Land Cruiser, I think, if it's in certain forms of conservation. Now, building and fueling vehicles like planes and cars and 4x4s takes a huge amount of material and a huge amount of energy. So why is it that we feel okay doing that in service of conservation? And I think it should be that we feel that particular use case is such that the material and energy implications are more than outweighed by the good. And really, that's the same framework that we ought to be bringing to AI. that yes, AI takes materials to build the machines, in this case data centers, and fuel those machines, energy. But those of us working with AI for good, whether that's health education or in our case, sustainability and nature, believe that there are many different use cases where the pros outweigh the cons in terms of energy and material use. And that's what we're looking for. There are plenty of ways that you could use AI irresponsibly, whether that's energy or in other ways, but we think there are plenty of ways that we can use it responsibly, where actually at point of use, the energy implications are relatively small.
So kind of the lesser of two evils in some ways.
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. Just being mindful of that on a case by case, and then to give you an example with actually maybe I could say give you a practical example, like the energy use of running things like small deep learning models to do things like sound and vision ID on device, so-called edge computing, can be really quite low. And yet that can extract so many useful signals from reality. So that use of AI there, that feels something where the benefits clearly outweigh the costs. But there are plenty of other ways to use AI that wouldn't be like that. So to say a little bit about Google, it's just to say it's another reason I'm very happy to be inside Google, because this is a very serious conversation inside Google as well. And Google has been taking the energy use of its data centers very seriously for years. For example, since 2017, we purchased enough renewable electricity to cover the entire energy use of all of our data centers, 100% every year since 2017. We're also actively working to make the algorithms more efficient all the time and the data centers more efficient. We had a big gain of efficiency last year. And then last but not least, the big corporate customers and many others would tend to use Google AI through Google Cloud. And Google Cloud now makes available to the user tools that allow you to estimate the energy implications of your AI use as well. So again, it's actually, you're not just having to guess, but actually we're giving people an informed choice about the marginal energy use for a given use case. So yeah, thanks for a great question.
Makes sense. And I have a kind of another slight challenge question from Tom Heap, actually, which is, one of the joys of nature is its mystery, the unknown. That's what gives us the thrill of the wild. Is Google and some of the tech that we heard about earlier destroying that magic?
Well, look, I mean, hopefully I illustrated slightly earlier. For me personally, it's been the opposite. I think I know we're all different, aren't we? We heard about differences in raptors earlier. That was fascinating, the personality of those, I think, Philippine eagles. I mean, and so my personality, I'm kind of an abstract thinker in a way. And actually, for me, the science of ecology, theoretical ecology, and then going into big data and now AI and technology has been actually my way of connecting with nature. And it's like we were talking about it earlier, Maeve. I feel like, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I kind of feel like somehow I need a concept before I can connect to reality. I'm not that kind of scientist that can look at nature in the raw and conceptualize it. I'm glad there are others that can, but for me, so that's been my route. But I think also at another level, just to back up what Tom's saying, I mean, I absolutely 100% agree with that. Like there is an infinite depth of interaction and complexity, within every organism on Earth and between those organisms too, that we'll never understand, I think. And that is part of the joy, to know that we'll never complete the job in a sense. But we're really coming at things from a more practical standpoint at the moment, thinking, we've got this amazing thing that's happening, which is this growing awareness of nature. That yes, in government circles, in things like NGOs and conservation charities, but increasingly even in the private sector. We're finding that there's this explosion in interest in nature and biodiversity information in the finance sector, in the global manufacturing sector, etc. And so we're looking at it for this part of our work, largely a bit more practically thinking, can we, as much as possible, give all of those actors and decision makers the information they need to act?
It sounds like we need both sides, in order to actually get anywhere. And we retain the magic. We all, especially everyone in this room, knows the magic, but we also do need the practical side, it sounds. Last question. So I haven't asked you about whether kind of this data is free, whether this map is completely accessible to everyone. Someone's asked, how can NGOs with scarce resources, often in developing countries, for example, in Africa, access your data to better protect their wildlife?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I'm glad we have got an opportunity to say that. So our default is we just give everything away for free. So any of our derived information, any of the maps will be available for free. And we also by default give the models away and the code so that people can fine tune and reproduce that work. So I mentioned Perch, for example. I mean, if you're interested in Perch, you can download it from a thing called GitHub and try it yourself, for example. So that's one side of it. So I think just to be clear, we just give everything away. That's the intention. The second thing, maybe that is worth mentioning there is this trend for foundational work in AI, and I do think that is changing things quite quickly. So this idea that with these foundational models, which includes things like the large language models, this really drops the barrier to entry for people all around the world to experiment with AI. You know, whether in terms of you don't need the compute you used to need, you don't need the data you used to need, you don't
need a background in it. You can just go and try it out.
That's right. Yeah. And you know, one simple thing I always say to everyone, and of course, you know, by the way, everyone should be very cautious using LLMs. Like, we should be cautious about using all AI. They do have some problems with hallucinations and biases, so you should read about those and be cautious, just like with the energy use. Just to be clear, you know, that's real. But having said that, you know, if you really want to learn more about AI, what you can do with it, how to get started, just ask the AI. This is another incredible thing, you know. I mean, you know, when people invented steam engines and someone said, what can I do with that? You couldn't ask the steam engine, right? But AI can just talk to the AI. They're incredibly good at telling you about their pros and cons, their uses. They've got any concepts you're not sure about, how to get started, what kind of software to install, etc. So it's a sort of self-describing technology in that sense. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, do we? I think we do. Maybe one last one. Oh, one last one. So the last question is, what am I going to go for? Is there a potential for Google DeepMind to partner with Whitley Award winners for mutual benefits?
Well, I mean, given that this is going out publicly, it's being recorded, right? So therefore, I'm going to have to say yes. and what I mean is, you know. And what I mean by that is that's on record. Yes is on record. There obviously are, and even we have a little green room with the speakers, right? And even just the initial conversations I had there, straight away I heard about the need to see if we can identify the nests of Philippine eagles from space, see if we can track where the juvenile leopards go when they disperse and their movement paths, etc. They were just two examples that popped out just immediately. So and that's really what this is about, yeah. And I think, you know, we can do a certain style of work in this community, which tends to be large scale, aggregating lots of data, but we can only get anywhere if we also partner with people on the ground actually doing conservation. So, and we do that in some of our projects already, by the way. But the people I've heard from today is just amazing, and the projects you're doing. So yes, that's a resounding yes.
Come and talk to Drew if you're interested. Please give him a big round of applause. Thank you.